Here are 5 clever electrical tips, including why I think you won't mind giving up these. Tip number 5, there is a way better alternative out there to using these. Tip number 5 is to stop using morettes. So these things basically have a little metal housing on the inside, and these are used to try to connect your wires. And the fact is, you just don't know if it's actually making a positive connection or not. So the replacement that is so much easier to use and so much better is these guys. These are called lever nuts. So you can take a couple of wires like this, and let's grab one of these that does too. And if you look up close here, inside there's a couple of inserts, and when you close one of these, you can see that metal inside there where it's pinching down and making a positive connection. So as I feed my 2 wires in here, just feed them both in like that, push down the lever, and then with that, I've got a nice positive connection. I can visibly see that the levers are engaged, so there's no issues there. Another great thing about these is even if you've got a situation where you've got several wires, here I've got 5 different ones, and I've even got one that's a much heavier gauge than these 14 gauge wires here, I can still feed all of them in, make sure they're all pushed in, lock down the levers, and then I can use these 5, and if I need to change something out, let's say I need to replace the source for this one, I can pull that one out and then put a different one in later, slide that in, lock it down, it's in there snug, and I'm good to go. Now these kits are pretty inexpensive. They're usually around 20 bucks, and the nice thing is they have all different kinds of connectors. There's lots of pieces in here, and you have that peace of mind of knowing that everything is connected exactly the way it should be, and there's no guesswork involved. Tip number 4, when you need to splice wires together, twisting them is not the answer. If you're trying to fix a wire that's been cut like this one, start by stripping the wires about 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters deep, exposing the wires inside. Twist each set of wires until it resembles one solid wire. Slide some heat shrink tubing over one side, and we'll come back to this toward the end of this step. Starting with one of the wires, create a hook where the rest of the wire follows parallel to the existing wire, and then bend over the end at 90 degrees like this. Now repeat that on the other wire. Line it up like you see here, and then once you've got the open ends going through the loops of the opposite piece, then grab those open ends and pull tight. You can see it creates a perfect little knot here, and as you pull apart, it's just going to tighten that knot, making a stronger and stronger bond. If you need to, you can snip off any excess wires that are hanging out over the insulated area, slide over the heat shrink tubing, and then melt it a little bit with a lighter. The 2 wires have now become one again. They're sealed and protected with a good contact signal, and they're not going anywhere. This is a super strong bond now. You can give those a good pull, and they're not going to come loose no matter what. Tip number 3, there's no need to replace an entire cord if just the plug or end has gone bad. We've all seen this before, where your cord seems to break in exactly the wrong spot, right up near the plug. Fortunately, there's a pretty easy solution to this. To start, you'll need to cut the cord where you can get a nice clean end. Looking inside, we can see that we've got 3 wires here. We need to expose the 3 inner wires, so to do this, we'll use a sharp blade and make a small cut or incision at the end of the cord. We can then peel it open, and then pull those wires back to get as much as we need. In this case, a couple of inches will do just fine. Cut off the excess and then strip about 1/2 inch of wire on each one. We can now get rid of the old plug, and we're going to replace that with a standard 3-prong replacement plug. Just like the old one, this one has a ground, a hot, and a neutral. You can just pull the top right off and then feed the wires in through the back. The colors of the wires inside the cord that you're fixing may vary in color. Sometimes they might actually be black, white, and green, just like you'd find in an outlet, but more often than not they're using other colors. In this case, the brown, the blue, and the green are pretty traditional, and the brown represents the hot or the line, the blue represents the neutral, and the green is ground. The colors of the screws inside the replacement plug are typically going to be brass, silver, and green. Green is always ground, brass is always hot, and silver is always neutral. Loosen each of the 3 screws and then feed the wires in and tighten them for a good secure connection. If you need to, feel free to trim any excess wire so there's no extra wire hanging out. With the wires securely in place, you can put the top of the plug back in and then use the 3 coarse threaded screws to fasten it in place. The last step is to tighten the clamp on the back. There are 2 screws to fasten there, and once you've got those tightened down, that plug is nice and secure, not going anywhere, and as good as new. Now these replacement plugs come in both the 3-prong and the 2-prong or non-grounded variety, and they usually cost just about $2 to $5 at the hardware store. I'll put some links in the description below in case you want to pick one of those up online. Tip number 2 is to always work with the grain when you're working with screw terminals. You've probably heard the term righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. What some people get confused by is the fact that that refers to the top of the rotation. So on a screw like this, for example, on this light switch, when you turn the screw clockwise, the top of the screw turns to the right. And that's where the righty-tighty, lefty-loosey comes into play. When you're using a hook like this, ideally you always want the open end of that hook to be towards the right. If you line your hook up backwards, like I've got here where the opening is on the left, then what can happen is as you tighten, it's going to try to open up that hook, and it could slide it right out from underneath the head of the screw. The more you tighten, the more likely it is to push it right out. I'm tightening this one down, for example, until it's nice and snug, and when it feels like it's all the way tight and everything's got a good connection, you can see that it's actually popped right out the sides, and I can just pull it away. If, on the other hand, I choose to go with the grain by putting the opening on the right side, then as I tighten that down, both the screw and the plate underneath it are going to tend to close that hook, and that's going to create better contact and a better electrical bond between the wire and the terminal. For this demonstration, I used a pretty loose hook just to show you what could happen, but if you use a tighter hook, you're going to have better results no matter what. In fact, you can see there's a little ledge or a little drop off so that it tends to hold that hook or that wire captive inside there. So these are really designed to work as best as possible even if you do it wrong, but by doing it right, you're going to get better contact and a better signal every time. This same tip applies even more so to stranded wires like this one. If you place the wire in the wrong orientation or against the grain, as you tighten the screw, it will tend to push all of those little strands out and away from the screw itself, making an even poorer connection. When you place it with the grain, it's going to tend to pull those wires along with the tightening of the screw and make a much better connection. Better yet, tighten up those threads as much as you can by twisting them into one solid piece, wrap it around with the grain, tighten it, and you'll get a much better connection overall. If you do have to connect a stranded wire like this to a screw terminal, one of the best ways is to use a U-type or a fork connector with the stranded wire and then just insert that under the screw. And as promised, tip number 1 is why I don't think you'll mind giving up these. Wire clippers have been around for a very long time. One of the trickiest things about them, however, is knowing what size wire you're trying to strip. Oftentimes you just don't know, and that requires a bit of guesswork to try one and then the other and see what works and what doesn't. Just a few years back, I got my first set of these new style universal wire strippers, and these are pretty awesome for a host of reasons. The way these work is very simple. Basically, it's got some jaws and it's going to grab both the right side and the left side, and it will pull the right side away from the left side. It will either remove that sheathing altogether or at least separate it enough that it's easy to pull off yourself. The crazy thing is this works on any size wire. I can do this on 20 gauge or 18 gauge like I've got here. I can do it on 14 gauge wire, and still not having touched a thing, I can do this on even 10 gauge or even 8 gauge wire. It doesn't care, and it doesn't matter what size wire I'm putting in there. Now those were all solid wire, but you can see that this actually works just fine with stranded wire as well. The best part is it doesn't actually cut into the wires themselves. A lot of times when you're using a sharp blade and you're trying to cut it precisely, you end up cutting some of the wires, and that weakens the signal and gives you less area to make contact with. So whether it's a thicker stranded wire like we just did, or even a really thin and delicate one like this, it can handle it no problem. And if you look close up here, you can see that all of the wires are intact, nothing is missing. Universal wire strippers typically tend to come with all of the features that you see on traditional wire strippers, like crimpers in the handle and a wire cutter. Now there's one other huge feature that these universal wire strippers have that traditional wire strippers can't touch, and that is they can tear the sheathing really easily off of complex wires. Let's take a look, for example, at this Ethernet wire. Typically, to open this up, you're going to have to make a little slit somewhere and then pull that sheathing back. But with these universal wire strippers, place them in there anywhere you want and it will just break that right off. Piece of cake. This also works super well on multi-wire cables like Romex. Here's some 14.2 cable, for example, that it handles no problem. It even works on 14.3, which is wider than the jaws themselves. But as you can see, I can grab onto it, pull it apart, and then I can either yank the rest of that off or just flip it around and cut that as well. Remember earlier when we were trying to replace that plug on that power cord? Well, those little 3 cables that are in there are pretty delicate and we don't want to cut into those. So rather than snipping the end and then pulling the sheathing back, you can just use some universal wire strippers and it will pull that outside sheathing off without a problem. Then, without touching a thing, you can also strip the 3 small wires inside. As you can see here, this is rated for 10 to 24 gauge wire, but I found that you can go lower than that and higher than that, and this thing can handle just about anything without any problem. If you are working with finer wires, there is this little knob here that you can twist to adjust the delicacy or the pressure with which it actually pulls those apart. These wire strippers also have a depth stop built in. So if, for example, you want to take off a 1/2 inch off of a whole bunch of wires, you can just set your depth stop to a 1/2 inch, push each wire up against it, squeeze the trigger, and you'll get consistent results on every wire. Now hold on, we're not done just yet. There's actually 7 more things I want to show you. Hopefully you found some cool stuff in there. But what about painter's tape? I've got 7 clever tips for painter's tape that you can check out right here. And I'm pretty sure you're going to learn something new in there. By the way, none of them involve painting as it turns out. So go ahead and click on that, tap on that, do your thing.